Hey everyone, this is Hafizullah Masoudi and you are watching From Code with Hafiz. I welcome you to the 10th video of this series where we will discuss a CSS layout position property, CSS Z-index and CSS overflow. So first of all, we have the position property, which specifies the type of positioning method used for an element. There are 5 different position values: static, relative, fixed, absolute and sticky. So after declaring the position property, then we can position an element using the top, bottom, left and right properties. However, these properties will not work unless the position property is not set first, and each position value works differently depending on its value, so keep this in mind. Now by default, all HTML elements are positioned static, and static positioned elements are not affected by the top, bottom, left and right properties. In fact, an element positioned static is not positioned in any special way, and it is always positioned according to the normal flow of the page. So to show you some examples, so let's create an h2. So let's say CSS layout position property, and then let's create a paragraph. So I will put some lorem ipsum, and after the paragraph let's create a div. So let's create a div and let's give it a class of static, and inside this div let's say this is, or let's say this element is positioned static. Now in our styles tag at the head section, let's target the div with a class of static. So div.static and curly braces, and let's say position, and we want this one static, and let's give it some border. So border, let's say 3px solid and green. So if we refresh the browser now, so you can see this div is positioned static. Next up, if an element is positioned relative to its normal position, setting the top, right, bottom and left properties of the element will cause it to be adjusted away from its normal position. Now the other content will not be adjusted to fit into any gap left by the element. So to show you an example of this one, let's get back to Visual Studio Code. So let's create another div, and what we can do is duplicate this one, and for this one let's say the class should be relative, and now let's target this class. So we can do the same. Let's say div dot relative curly braces, and let's say position, and we want this one to be relative, and let's say we want some left, so 30 pixels, and let's also give it some border, so 3px solid, and let's say in green. And if we refresh the browser now, you can see, well, they are stick together. So let's put some, or let's comment the first div because we don't need it anymore. So let's comment this one, and if I refresh now, you can see it is getting this left of 30 pixels. Next up, if an element is a position fixed, it will be relative to the viewport, which means it always stays in the same place even if the page is scrolled. The top, right, bottom and left properties are used to position the element, and a fixed element does not leave a gap in the page where it would normally have been located. So to show you some examples, let's get back to Visual Studio Code and let's comment this one, and let's say we want to duplicate this one, and let's say uncommented, and let's give it a class of fixed, and let's also change this one to fixed, and in our style tag, so let's press enter here, and let's say div dot fixed curly braces, and now let's say position fixed, and let's give it some bottom 0, and let's say for example right 0, and let's give it a width also, so 300 pixels, and let's give it some border too. So 3px solid in green, and if we save this, refresh the browser now you can see the div is positioned at the bottom right. So if we change this one to top, so let's say top should be 0, now div will move to the top. So let's refresh. Now you can see the div is in the top right corner. Next up, we have an element with position absolute, which is relative to the nearest positioned ancestor, which is instead of positioned relative to the viewport like fixed. However, if an absolute positioned element has no positioned ancestors, it uses the document body and moves along with page scrolling. Now an absolute positioned element will be removed from the normal flow and will overlap elements. So to show you some examples, let's get back to the Visual Studio Code and let's remove all of this code so to not get confused. Now let's remove these one too. Well, let's leave the first div, so let's remove the two others. Now what I will do is, for the first div class, let's say for example a relative, and inside the div let's leave this one. So for the position, let's say a relative, and next up after the content, let's create another div. So div, and let's give it a class of absolute, and for the content let's duplicate this one, and for the text let's say this is an absolute element, so absolute in here. Now let's style these divs. So in our style tag, first of all let's say div dot relative, and for the position let's say relative, and then we have the width, so let's say width 400 pixels, and height should be let's say 200 pixels, and border should be 3px, and let's say solid green. And next up we have the div absolute, so absolute curly braces, and for this one let's say position, and we wanna say absolute, and top should be let's say 80 pixels, 80px, and right should be let's say 0, and we want a width for this one, so let's say 200px, and height should be 100px, and let's say border, so border 3px solid, and let's say red. So if we save this and refresh the browser now you can see this div is positioned absolute according to its nearest ancestor, which is the relative div. Next up we have position sticky, which is based on the user's scroll position. So a sticky element toggles between relative and fixed depending on the scroll position. So it is positioned relative until a given offset position is met in the viewport, then it sticks in a place like fixed position. Now note that Internet Explorer does not support sticky positioning, and Safari requires a WebKit prefix, and you must also specify at least one of the top, right, bottom or left properties for sticky positioning to work. So to show you some examples, let's get back to Visual Studio Code and let's remove all of this code from here, and let's remove this div also. Now we will create another one. So first let's create the div, and I will declare a style for this div in here, and let's give it some padding of bottom. So padding bottom, and let's say 2000px, and this is to create some scrolling or vertical scrolling, so to better understand the sticky positioning. And let's create some paragraphs here, and let's put a lorem ipsum, and let's duplicate it a couple of times. And now what we can do is give this div, or outside the div before the content we will create another div, and for this one let's say a class sticky, and inside this one let's say this is a sticky element. Now let's style this. So we will now target this div with the class of sticky. So in here let's say div dot sticky curly braces, and in here let's say position, and we want this one dot WebKit sticky, and next up we want position, and let's say sticky, and next up let's say declare the top, so it should be 0, and we also want to give it some padding, so 5px, and let's also declare a background color, so let's say hash CAE E8CA, and next up let's also give it some border, and let's say 2px solid and hash 4CAF50. Now if we save this, get back to our browser, refresh, now let's scroll down, so you can see now the div is sticking to the top. So this is how the sticky positioning works. So you can see I am scrolling to the bottom, but we are still seeing the sticky div. And you can also notice that whenever it reaches this specific position in the page, then it will become the fixed element. So you can see now it is fixed. Now next up we have the CSS layout z-index property. So when elements are positioned, they can overlap other elements, and the z-index property specifies the stack order of element and that which element should be placed in front of or behind the others. And the stack order can either positive or be negative values. So to show you some examples, let's get back to Visual Studio Code, and let me remove all of this styling from here, and let's also remove all of this code because we don't need it. So first of all let's create an h1 here, and let's say this is a heading, and next up let's create an image tag, and for this one let's say we want to go to images and let's load the image tree. So in here let's say image for the alt, and let's say we want a paragraph 2, and let's put some lorem ipsum. So for now if I refresh the browser, well, the image is not loading for some reason. So let's see what is the problem, and yeah, we have this extra slash in here, so let's remove this. And if we refresh now, so now you can see we have our heading and then the image and then the paragraph. So let's show you how z-index works. So let's get back to Visual Studio Code, and let's target the image. So let's say image curly braces, and let's first give it a position, and let's say absolute, and let's say left should be 0 and top should be, for example, 0, and next let's declare the z-index. So for the z-index let's say -1 because we want to send it to the back. So let's refresh the page now. Now you can see the image is in the back of other content, and now our paragraph has moved to the top, and our heading is at the top of the image. So z-index only works on positioned elements, but not static positioned and flex items, which are elements that are direct children of display. Now you will learn about flex later in this course, so don't worry about this now. Now let's show you another z-index example. So let's get back to Visual Studio Code, and let me remove all of this code, and let's also remove this one. So let's create some elements. Let's first of all create an h1, and let's say z-index examples or example, and let's create a paragraph, and let's put some lorem ipsum, and next up let's create a div. So I will give it a class of a container, and then I will create another div with a class of, let's say, black box, so black - box, and for this one let's say a black box, so with z index of 1, and let's duplicate it a couple of times. So this will be with z index of 3, and this will be 2. So for the second one let's say gray box, and for the third one let's say green box. Now we will style these boxes, so let's go to our style tag in the section, and in here first of all let's say dot container, so to style the container, and let's give it some position, so relative, and let's say now dot black hyphen box curly braces, and let's say position. So after the position, let's say z index. So for the black box we have z index of 1, so let's say 1, and let's give it some border, so 2px solid black, and let's give it some height, so let's say 100px, and let's say margin, and let's say 30px. And next up we have the gray box, so let's say dot gray hyphen box curly braces, and for this one let's say position absolute, and next up let's say z index, so z index, and then we want this one to be 3, and let's say background, so background, and let's say light gray, and next up let's declare some height for it, and let's say 60px, and let's also give it some width, so let's say 70%, and let's give it some lift, so 50px, and let's give it some top, so 50px, and let's scroll down, and let's finally design the green box, so let's say dot green hyphen box curly braces, and for this one let's say position should be absolute, and for the background let's say light green, so light green, and let's say width, and this should be 35%, and we want for this one left, so for example 270px, and let's also declare some top minus 15px, and let's also give it some height, so 100px. Now first of all let's comment all of this code, or let's comment the z index of each one of them. Well, for the final one, which is the green box, we don't have any z index, so let's declare it also, and then we will try it. So let's say z index, and let's say this one is 2. So let's comment the z index first and see the divs. So let's comment these, and let's get back to the browser, and if I refresh now you can see the black box has the index 1, and the gray box has the index 3, and well, all of them are black. So let's fix their content also. So for this one let's say gray, and for the last one let's say green. So you can see guys their order, and notice that the black is at the very behind, and then we have the gray, and at the very top we have the green. So to uncomment their z index, let's uncomment this one, and uncomment this one too, and if we save this, refresh, now you can see the black box is having the z index of 1, which was as before, so it is at the very behind. Then we have the z index 2, which is this green box, and it is the second element which comes after the black box. And then at the very top of other content we have the gray box with z index 3. Now finally we have the CSS layout overflow property, which controls what happens to the content that is too big to fit into an area. So the overflow property specifies whether to clip the content or to add a scroll bars when the content of an element is too big to fit in the specified area. The values that can be described for overflow are visible, hidden, scroll, and auto. And the overflow property only works for block elements with a specified height, so keep this in mind. Now by default the overflow is visible, which means that it is not clipped and it renders outside the elements box. So to show you some examples, let's get back to Visual Studio Code, and let's remove all of this code from here because we don't need it. So let's remove this one too, and let's create a div, for example, or let's first create an h1. So let's say this is a heading, and then let's create a div. So inside the div, let's put some lorem ipsum, and let's target the div in our style tag. So div curly braces, and for this one let's say background color, and let's say coral, and let's say width should be 200 px, and let's give it some height, so 65 px, and let's give it some border, so 1 px solid, and let's give it some overflow, so let's say visible. Now this is the default, but it is to show you how this works. So let's refresh the browser now, and now you can see that how the overflow visible is working. So we have this div with a specific width and height. Now you can see that the content does not fit the div and the overflow is visible. So next up we have overflow hidden value, in which the overflow is clipped and the rest of the content is hidden. So to show you this one, let's get back to Visual Studio Code, and instead of visible let's say hidden. Now if we refresh the browser, you can see now the content does not fit the box, but the overflow is hidden. And next up we have overflow scroll value, in which the overflow is clipped and a scroll bar is added to scroll inside the box. So let's get back to Visual Studio Code, and for this one let's say scroll, and if we refresh now, so you can see now we have a scroll bar in the box to see all of the content, so we can scroll down and up. Now note that this will add a scroll bar both horizontally and vertically, even if you do not need it. So for example, for this one you can see we need the vertical scroll bar, but we don't need the horizontal scroll bar, but it is still showing the horizontal scroll bar. So if you wanna show scroll bars whenever you need them for the overflow, you can declare auto, so this will do the job. So let's get back to Visual Studio Code, and in here let's say auto, and now if we refresh, so now you can see we only need the vertical scroll bar, and that is the reason it is showing. So now we don't have the horizontal scroll bar. Now next up we have overflow X and overflow Y properties to change the overflow of content just horizontally or vertically or both. So overflow X is for the left and right edges of the content, and overflow Y is for the top and bottom edges of the content. So to show you some examples, let's get back to Visual Studio Code, and let's remove the overflow property, and let's say overflow X, and we want the vertical to be hidden, or sorry, horizontal to be hidden, and let's say overflow Y, which is the vertical overflow, and we want this one to be scroll. So if we refresh the browser now you can see the vertical is showing and the horizontal is hidden. Now this being done, this was everything about this video, and I hope you enjoyed watching the video and found it useful. If so, don't forget to give the thumbs up and a nice comment also, and if you are new to this channel, don't forget to subscribe too if you want more videos like this. So thanks for watching, see ya in the next video.